Good afternoon, grade 12s. Welcome to another telematics history session. Today we're going to be focusing on essay work, and I'm going to look at two themes in particular. One from paper 1, which relates to your civil rights movement essay, and the other essay that we're going to focus on today comes from paper 2, which relates to the content on the 1990s, namely the road to democracy and how South Africa is going to deal with its past. So without further ado, let's start doing that revision as we start making our way and preparing for our September exams and ultimately the final exams at the end of the year. So the civil rights movement essay. I think at this stage we can start having a look at our PowerPoint presentation for today. In your telematics workbook, you can turn to page 13. In that telematics workbook, on page 13, you'll see we've included a timeline that contains key events. Grade 12s, I think timelines are important because it's another technique and means for us to study as we make our way through all of the content. We know that history is a content-rich subject, and it's filled with so much content that we need to understand, we need to memorize, but we also, grade 12s, need to contextualize the content. And what timeline enables us to do is actually contextualize the content as well. So if you look at your timeline on page 13, I've already started making some indicators for myself on my timeline in front of me. You can use the timeline in your book on page 13, and then we can watch how I've actually tried to group some of the areas and make sense for myself. So the timeline covers some of the key events that take place during the civil rights movement. One of the first key events that take place that we are aware of might be the Linda Brown versus the Board of Education court case. In that court case, we know that Linda Brown's parents took the school to court, and the court eventually found, the Federal Court of America eventually found, that segregation was illegal in public schools. Even though we know that segregation was then deemed illegal by the courts, it did not necessarily mean that American society was actually going to change its actions. And because the American government found that society was not really changing their actions, it got to a place where forced integration to a certain extent had to take place. These events are then linked to the Little Rock Nine, or what becomes known as the Little Rock Nine in history, as we watch the forced integration of schools taking place. When you set up your timeline and you understand the various dates according to the timeline, you start to see the cause, and as a result, you also start to understand the effects that it has, or you understand how a particular event starts off and then sets up a path for another event to occur. So the one example that we've indicated on our timeline is school segregation that's made illegal, and eventually it's going to link up to the Little Rock 9 case of 1967. You'll notice, grade 12s, that I've actually color-coded those events for myself in green. Then I start to make another grouping for myself that makes sense according to my timeline. This time, you've noticed, I start to work with blue. In 1955, I'm told that Rosa Parks is arrested. Rosa Parks, we'll remember, is the lady who refused to sacrifice and give up her seat on the bus for a white gentleman. And as a result, she was then arrested. This arrest leads to the Montgomery bus boycotts, also in 1955, which we've marked in blue as well. You then have the bus boycotts that continue for almost a year. So by 1956, we find that the bus boycotts are going to end. But this is not actually the end of the idea of buses and the ending of segregation on buses. Later on, this is going to have another effect over here. We can see we make our way through to the freedom rides. We follow our arrow. It takes us through to 1961. We know that on interstate buses in America and at certain service stations, buses still weren't, or bus stations certainly weren't desegregated. And so changes had to take place in America. We know that certain students from the north decided that they were going to sacrifice some of their time and they were going to test the theory of whether the bus system had actually been desegregated. It results in lots of violence, but we understand as history learners, because we're working within a context and because we're working with cause and effect, that the events of the freedom bus rides are actually linked to a longer case and history of bus desegregation within the southern states of America. So you've noticed I've indicated all of the points that link to the bus deintegration system in blue on our chart over here. Then another point that I could possibly draw our attention to is the idea of the speeches. Part of the civil rights movement is characterized by a number of speeches and marches that take place within the movement as well. One march that many of us are familiar with already is often referred to as the I Have a Dream speech march as well. It's referred to as the March on Washington or the March to Lincoln Memorial. That is when Martin Luther King delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech. Another march that also takes place is sometimes nicknamed the Children's Crusade. If it's not referred to as the Children's Crusade, your teacher might have referred to it as the Birmingham March as well. It also takes place in 1963. And so you'll notice that I've indicated my marches that link up in red. There's another famous march that takes place during the Civil Rights Movement. It happens in 1965. It's referred to as the Selma March. Within that Selma March, the citizens decide that they are going to go on a march because they'd like to draw attention to the lack of voting rights that African Americans have. And the fact that even though African Americans can vote, there are very few people who have actually registered to vote. And so you'll notice again on my map to help me study over here according to my timeline, I've linked all of my various marches that I consider important in red. Also over here, I can start drawing other connections, grade 12s. I can start linking how some of the laws are passed with various colors. According to my timeline, it says in 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. I know that this comes about directly as a result of that march that took place in Selma in 1965. The same thing happens with the 1968 Civil Rights Act that gets passed. This Civil Rights Act that gets passed is linked to this I Have a Dream speech, because one of the key themes for the I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington in 1963 is actually linked to the fact that they are trying to pass the Civil Rights Act in America. As you start to group your ideas, because some of us are vibrant and we work well with colors, as you start to group your ideas and use color when you study, history starts coming alive and you can start to see how connections start to build and form. So please remember that, grade 12s. Timelines make a very important method when we actually go about studying and learning our work and progressing through history. And don't forget the importance of color to also inspire us and motivate us while we work. Now I want us to turn our attention to the screen again. This time I want us to look at an extract from the exam guidelines document. I'm sure that you might have heard your teacher, grade 12s, mention the exam guidelines document. There's an exam guidelines document that gets delivered to our schools and it's issued to each learning area. These exam guidelines documents from the Education Department guide us in terms of the required content that we need to engage with at grade 12 level. It breaks it down usually according to your various papers. So history has details about paper 1, paper 2, and I've actually taken an extract directly from this exam guidelines document, and it indicates to us what the required content is for the essay on the Civil Rights Movement. I want you to look at this content very carefully with me, grade 12s. It says civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s. It tells us that the focus question for the essay on this area is going to relate to the Civil Rights Movement. It says that when we include content in our essay, the content must focus on reasons and origins of the Civil Rights Movement in the USA. What they are basically encouraging us to do over there is to include enough background information. We need to explain why the Civil Rights Movement has come about, why there was a need for the Civil Rights Movement. If we go on to the next point, we need to start speaking about leadership within the Civil Rights Movement. So we want to speak about the role and the impact and the influence that a man such as Martin Luther King had on the Civil Rights Movement. Then it starts to shift and change gear in the essay. We start writing about forms of protest through civil disobedience. They mention a few areas that they'd like us to touch on. The one is the Montgomery bus boycott. The next example of civil protest that they want us to talk about is sit-ins. The next one that they want us to talk about would be the marches. And here you can see that they tell us that when we talk about the marches, we must include detail around the marches of Lincoln Memorial, that would relate to the Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. We need to speak about the Birmingham campaign, which is going to also link to the Children's Crusade, and we need to speak about the Selma Montgomery March, which relates to the Voters' March that I spoke about earlier on. Then the tone of the essay is going to shift gear again, and we're going to start assessing the successes and the shortcomings of the civil rights movements and the various protests. Your essay is going to start wrapping up by looking at the short-term and long-term gains of the civil rights movement. If you take a look at your screen, grade 12s, you'll notice that I've included something at the bottom. I've now taken Brown versus the Board of Education, which is Linda Brown, who I referred to earlier on, and Little Rock. I've also taken Freedom Rides, and I've taken Freedom Summer, and I've actually ruled a line through it. The reason why I've done this, grade 12s, is because the civil rights movement is rich in terms of content for a grade 12 learner. It's also very interesting. And sometimes within our exam paper, when we answer the question, we want to show the markers that we have a wealth of knowledge. The problem is that sometimes we tend to include content that is not necessarily required within the essay to help boost our essay and bolster our mark. This comes at the shortcoming of content that must actually be included. So the reason why I've shown you the short little snippet from the exam guideline is so that you can start to understand what must be included. Once you've included the compulsory information and the compulsory content to use in order to build your line of argument, you are then free to include another example. Then you can start linking in something such as Freedom Summer, for example, or the Freedom Rides on the buses. But up until that point, up until you've included everything that's actually in that block that we've taken directly from the exam guidelines, I wouldn't really encourage you to include additional information at the expense of the crucial core content that you're meant to be including. I'd like to remind you about that, grade 12s. Let's move on. If you go to page 13, again, in your telematics pack, you'll see that they've given us an example of a question over there. It says grade 12, civil society protest from the civil rights movement. I've said, let's analyze this question. The focus area for the line of argument, I'd like us to be able to ascertain what the focus area for our line of argument should be. And I also want the question to guide us in the formulation of our introduction. So let's start off, grade 12s, by looking at how we can use the question to determine where they want the focus area for our essay to actually be. The question says, explain to what extent the various forms of protest. So now, okay, I need to speak about various forms of protest by the civil rights activists were successful in ensuring that all Americans, regardless of race, were treated equally in the United States of America in the 1960s. It then goes on to say that I need to support my line of argument with relevant evidence, and that's going to be worth 50 marks. Essentially, grade 12s, I think this question is set up beautifully. It very clearly tells us what is required of us in order to answer this question. We need to speak about the forms of protest. If we go back to our exam guidelines, you'll see we need to mention marches. And we already said that under marches, I'm expecting you to speak about 3 marches. You need to speak about the idea of bus boycotts. You need to make mention of sit-ins and so forth. So all of the examples that we came across in the exam guidelines that related to forms of protest needs to come up in this essay. They also start speaking about the idea that it was successful. This relates to the last focus point that we've seen in our exam guidelines, where it says we need to focus on the short-term and long-term gains of the civil rights movement, offer an assessment of whether the civil rights movement was successful, and also be able to identify what the shortcomings were. Lastly, it speaks about the fact that ultimately the aim of the civil rights movement was related to equality and getting all Americans to be treated equally. So as we develop a line of argument in our essay, we are going to see, does the civil rights movement manage to bring about equality or a sense of equality? It gives us a focus area for place. They want us to speak about the United States. And very importantly, they also give us a period, the 1960s. And if you go to the overall section of the exam guideline, which we've got up on the screen over there, it says question 3, civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s. But you'll see that our question has limited us in terms of what we're going to write about. We are only going to write about events from the 1960s. So I think we can remind ourselves about how to write an introduction in History Grade 12. There are 3 basic steps to our writing our introduction. We've been going over this since grade 11, and in some cases we've been going over it since grade 10. The 3 steps for our introduction relate to the fact that 1, we must take a stance. We must have an opinion in relation to how we feel about the question. We are either going to agree, disagree, or partially agree with the question. We might feel that to a great extent the question satisfies our needs in terms of the content that we're going to put out. The next step that we're going to put forward is going to be a reason in relation to the stance that we've taken. So we need to explain to the marker why we feel that we can agree or disagree with a question. And then our last step, which is part of the most important step, is to also orientate the marker. We need to give the marker a clear route map on the direction that we're going to take with our essay and what they can expect. So, to make our lives easier, we've already prepared an introduction that we can have a look at. What we now want to do in class grade 12 is see if we can identify the 3 steps that have taken place in the writing of this introduction. Remember the 3 steps. 1, you need to have a stance. 2, there must be some kind of indication relating to a reason for your stance. And then your last step will be pointing out to the examiner what your essay is going to cover. So, this introduction says, to a great extent, various forms of protest by civil rights activists were successful in ensuring that all Americans, regardless of race, were treated equally in the United States of America. Although all forms of protest were not equally successful, the civil rights movement ultimately impacted many spheres of American society to ensure that the citizens had equal access to their rights. This essay examines the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So grade 12, let's start marking off those 3 steps. That's the first outright step. That's going to be step number 2. Step number 2 is going to end there, and my step 3 is sitting over here. Watch how we've placed all of our content into a neat paragraph, because history is about forming paragraphs as we write. Please remember that you can't write an essay using bullet points. I know that some subjects such as economics allow us to write in bullet form, but history does not allow it. So, we've taken a stance. We've said, to a great extent, various forms of protest by the civil rights activists were successful in ensuring all Americans, regardless of race, were treated equally in the United States of America. What you should notice, grade 12, is that this entire first sentence is very reminiscent of the question. That is because I'd like to remind you, grade 12, that we've actually hugged the question and the quote that they've given us. Very often when we start writing our essays, we feel uncertain. We're not too certain about how to start. It's very important for us to get the focus by actually holding on to that question. Use the information that they give you in the question to structure your sentence. You'll then find that you become more confident within your writing. And once you've confidently written that first sentence, you'll find that you are able to formulate your second sentence when you go about giving your reason. You'll notice that at this stage, I am starting to feel more confident as a reader. In the past, we spoke about the fact that you can start your reason by saying, because. You can continue your first sentence and you can say, because all forms. But now as a grade 12 learner, I feel more confident. So I haven't started my reason with because. I've now gone on to using a new transitional word. To transition into my next sentence, I've said, although all forms of protest were not equally successful, so I'm pointing out that the civil rights movement does have some shortcomings, it ultimately impacts so many spheres of American society. Then very briefly, in my last step, I go on to orientate the marker, and I tell the marker, I'm going to study the civil rights movement, and I'm going to limit myself to the 1960s. From that point, I can then continue writing my civil rights essay. The next thing I'd like us to focus on for some civil rights work, grade 12s, is going to relate to paragraph writing. I'm going to show you a formal way now to structure your paragraph. Some of you will be familiar with the structure and method from English lessons as well. It's referred to as the Peel method. According to the Peel method, you start off by making a point, then you explain, then there must be evidence that you put forward in your paragraph, and then you need to link. You are going to offer a link so that you can link it into your next paragraph so that your writing can be fluid and there's transition through your work. So, according to the Peel method with point, you need to make sure you have an opening sentence for your paragraph. That must be a clear statement or point. Then you need to have a few sentences in your paragraph that should explain the point that you've just made. You need to offer your evidence, and evidence we know is so important and crucial for a history learner. You must offer the evidence in the next few sentences that support and substantiate the statement that you've made. And then lastly, as I said before, you're going to link it in. So let's look at an example of a paragraph that I've prepared. I've chosen to use the section where we need to speak about the background of the civil rights movement in the United States of America. The reason why I've chosen to do this particular section with you now, grade 12s, relates to the fact that very often grade 12 learners don't feel comfortable with the amount of content that they need to put in this paragraph. So let's look how we've broken this paragraph up. First, we start off with a bold statement, or we make a point. The point that we're making says, many African American people believed that their lives would change after the world wars. I need to explain how they feel their lives are going to change. So I explain that they had fought for their country in the world wars, and so they expected to be treated as equals. After all, we know that the world wars were fought so that people could be treated equally, with dignity, and that they could have access to all the human rights. So African Americans felt cheated. They felt as though they had gone to Europe, fought for other people's human rights and for other people's equality, but they weren't being granted those rights within their own country. Then I'm going to offer evidence. And for the evidence for this background paragraph, I say, activists were frustrated by the federal and the state government's lack of action to implement desegregation. They were also angered by the huge resistance of white Americans against the ending of segregation and the ongoing violence against black people, particularly in the southern states. Then we're going to offer a link, and our link says that it was in this context that various forms of civil rights protests emerged. And you'll see that according to the last sentence, the link, we are then able to go into our essay and offer the examiner the various forms of protests. While I do have that up on the screen, grade 12s, I want to just remind you about the difference between the federal government and the state's government. When we talk about federal and state government in America, federal government refers to the entire American body. So that's the umbrella. And then under the federal government, you've got various state governments as well. Those relate to the various states within America. Ultimately, your federal government is the ultimate law within the country. So the state can't pass a law that's going to be in conflict with your federal government in the country. And we are saying that African Americans were getting impatient with the slow rate of change that was taking place within their own state as well as the United States of America under this federal government, this umbrella government in the country. All right. That's all that we want to touch on when we look at the civil rights movement, because we still need to look at the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. This is an essay from paper 2. You'll notice at this stage, as we start making our way through the content in grade 12, this section is actually divided into two. One relates to the essay that deals with the coming of democracy to South Africa. And then there is a source-based section which also deals with coming to terms with the past. And that is the section that we'll be familiar with, which we know as the TRC. So let's have a look at example of the essay question that we can expect in paper 2 that relates to the 1990s and coming to terms with the past. The example that I have in front of me says, explain to what extent political leadership and commitment by key South African role players paved the way for the birth of a non-racial democratic South Africa in 1994. Again, it says that we need to support your line of argument with relevant evidence, and that's going to be worth 50 marks in the final paper. I've already indicated for us over there, grade 12s, that our essay needs to have a look at leadership in some way, and it clearly tells us they want to know the extent to which the political leadership plays a role, right? And how this is going to pave the way for a non-racial and democratic South Africa. I thought that it might be interesting if we have a look at the booklet that I spoke about earlier that refers to the exam guidelines. So I've included a screenshot of it so that you know exactly what it looks like. If you are uncertain, maybe you've never seen the booklet before, maybe your teacher has given you extracts of the booklet. If your class teacher or your history teacher is uncertain of what it looks like, that little screenshot is in the corner so you can make reference to it. It clearly says that it's the history exam guidelines for 2017. Please be sure that when you work with exam guidelines, grade 12s, that you are working with the correct edition. The latest edition of exam guidelines that came out for history came out in 2017. There is another guidelines, I think it came out in about 2014. That is the old guidelines, and those guidelines are no longer applicable in the current exams that we write. So all the information that we've taken to guide us as we make our way through our work actually comes from the 2017 exam guidelines for history. So I've gone to the exam guidelines. I've extracted the information that we need to talk about in this essay. It says the question focus must relate to a negotiated settlement. So we must make sure that our essay speaks about negotiations and how that brings about change. We also need to make sure that as we discuss the essay, we bring in the idea of the government of national unity. You'll notice here the bullets indicate the strong focus area for the content. Negotiations come up again. Then you have the breakdowns of negotiations that start. Another very important point is this idea of the violence, the ongoing violence they tell us in the country. And that is going to lead to the final road to democracy. The final road to democracy of 1994 is going to include the government of national unity, which gets mentioned over here. If we think back to the question that we had in our telematics booklet, it also included the idea of leadership. So as I start to build my essay now for the exam question that we just had a look at, I need to make sure that I've got various threads and themes that are coming through. One, I need to speak about the role of leadership according to the question, but according to the focus content that I know the exam guidelines also speaks about. I must speak about the importance of negotiations. I need to speak about the fact that there was ongoing violence that served as an obstacle on our path to democracy. And then ultimately, I need to build that essay in the direction where we get to 1994, where we have those non-racial elections in the country and the formation of the government of national unity. Let's see what it looks like when we start to nail it down. In terms of the content that we can start expecting, what I've done in the next few slides, grade 12s, is actually try to indicate to you how we can go about building our essay and breaking in various paragraphs as we start to write. This one tells us, oh, I've moved my screen. I didn't mean to. Right. This one tells us what happened in South Africa between 1990 and 1994. We start off with our introduction that needs to have a look at the question. Then the next thing we need to do is obviously remember that we have to relate the question and in order to formulate our content. I'm going to show you some content that I think is crucial for this paragraph right now in this essay. Then in the next slide, I'm going to show you how I use this content and I link it into the question to help strengthen my line of argument. In paragraph 1, I'm going to include the idea of the 1990s, right? And then I've asked us a question and I want you to start thinking about it as I read this content. How can we strengthen the content by emphasizing the line of argument in this essay? Remember when we read the question early on, it spoke about the fact that we needed to bring in the influence of political leadership and their commitment as role players in terms of bringing about democratic South Africa. The basic content that we know about says President de Klerk's speech on the 2nd of February 1990 unbanned the liberation movements. We also know that there are changes in security laws, that they ordered the release of Mandela and other political prisoners, and they started the process towards democracy. Then we also know that it speaks about Nelson Mandela's release on the 11th of February 1990, and that allowed the ANC to begin negotiations with the government. The paragraph I'm going to show you shortly, grade 12s, does not actually make use of the Peel method. But I think it's important that I show it to you because it practically shows you how you can build in your question as you start to develop your work. So now I formulated a paragraph using the content from the previous slide. This time you'll see it says, on the 2nd of February 1990, the leader of apartheid South Africa, President de Klerk, delivered a speech in which he unbanned the liberation movements and changed the security laws of the country. He also ordered the release of Mandela and other political prisoners. These announcements would enable South Africa to start the process towards democracy. The government had already acknowledged the role that the iconic leader of the struggle could play in this process. In return, Mandela displayed a willingness to negotiate. So his release on the 11th of February 1990 allowed the ANC to begin negotiations with the government. In this paragraph, grade 12, I have strengthened the line of argument by bringing in key factors that I know make up the focus area for this essay. I've also linked it to the question. So let's have a look at the words that I've included. Instead of simply speaking about President de Klerk, I've pointed out to my marker that I know that he's the leader of apartheid South Africa. And as I start writing, I show the leader that the leader of apartheid South Africa understands that he has a role to play in the way democracy is going to come about, because he is going to bring in all of these changes, such as the unbanning of the liberation movements. I go on. He announces that they're going to release Mandela. He speaks about, or I start speaking about the fact that this can bring about a process towards democracy as they start negotiations. You'll notice that I bring in the idea of a leader again. I point out that I understand that Mandela is an iconic leader of the struggle. Then I continue to say that Mandela as a leader understands the importance of negotiations. De Klerk understood that Mandela had an important role to play. Mandela goes on to show that he is a great leader as well, because he understands that he also has this role to play and he is willing to play that role. Then I start to link further into what I'm going to speak about in future paragraphs by saying that the willingness and the release of Nelson Mandela will allow the ANC and the government to begin negotiations. Already within that first paragraph, I'm starting to draw in clear links and ties into the content that must be covered in the essay. Let's move on to what needs to appear in paragraph 2 and 3. In paragraph 2 and 3, grade 12s, we need to start touching on the various obstacles that stand in the way of negotiations in the country. It says the ANC had been banned for 30 years, and so it had to reorganize itself as a political party as opposed to a movement for liberation. I'd like to remind you of that, grade 12s. Remember that in 1960 the ANC is banned, and so in effect it's actually a liberation movement when we speak about it before 1990, right? Then in 1990, when they are unbanned, they take on the status again of a party as they start to prepare themselves, looking forward to the elections of 1994. It says millions of ANC supporters expect a change to happen quickly. We also need to speak about the obstacles that stand in the way to negotiations from the part of the government, namely the National Party at the time. The government also had problems. Not all NP members agreed with de Klerk's reforms, and they were leaving the NP to join more conservative political groupings. You go on to say that the situations in the townships were difficult. Besides the poverty and the unemployment, there was a lot of violence. Many people suspected that the police helped to promote violence between the supporters of the ANC and the IFP, namely the Inkatha Freedom Party. You'll remember from class that your teacher would have spoke about the third force that was operating on the part of the government. It's at that point in time that South Africans need to start preparing for negotiations. I've put in a bullet over there to help us understand that negotiations relate to discussing issues that might stand in our way in order for us to reach an agreement. And so when we have negotiations, we discuss, and ultimately the parties will reach a point where they are willing to compromise in order to reach that agreement. There are 2 minutes that you need to speak about, one being the Groote Schuur minute, the other one being the Pretoria minute. I often tell my learners in class that the Groote Schuur minute and the Pretoria minute are talks about talks. It's discussions that are had and negotiations that are had in the ultimate build-up to the bigger negotiations that can take place, namely the CODESA talks. Make some points about what happens within the Groote Schuur minute. Point out to the marker that you know some of the details. Negotiations between the government and the ANC would begin in May 1990. These talks resulted in the Groote Schuur minute. They wanted to establish good communication channels between the government and the ANC. The government reviewed the existing security laws to ensure normal and free political activities. The Pretoria minute would then come from talks held between the ANC and the National Party in August 1990. The ANC suspended the armed struggle. Both parties would agree to promote normality, and the rules for an election were made, and an interim constitution was planned. We know that our constitution is a set of laws that govern the country, and we know that when we speak about the interim constitution, it was a temporary constitution to carry us through. If you have a look at the content on that we have up projected on the screen, grade 12s, let me remind you, this is the content, but this content does not contain a strong line of argument in relation to the question that was posed earlier on, which actually spoke about political leadership and their commitment and the roles that they play. So as we start to develop our essay, we need to use this content and then figure out a way that we can start speaking about the role of leaders as well. As you make your way through your content in your paper, always remember you need to go back to your original question. Ask yourself, am I sticking to the point? Can I bring in political leadership in the paragraph? Can I speak about their commitment and the role that they played in terms of bringing about democracy in South Africa? I see somebody's asked the question. A learner has asked, what are the roles of de Klerk? I think very often we don't necessarily appreciate the role that de Klerk actually plays. He starts off taking on South Africa at a very difficult stage. Essentially, he has inherited a country, grade 12s, that has been crippled by apartheid. And so when we speak about the role of de Klerk as a leader, we need to understand that ultimately he's the leader of the National Party that knows he needs to move South Africa forward. He is the leader of the National Party who has to make the speech in Parliament that says, effectively, apartheid is going to come to an end and South Africa is going to transition into a democracy. We haven't gotten to the point yet in the section that I'm speaking about where I want to touch on the role of violence in the country in the 1990s. The reality, grade 12, is that in the 1990s, the early 1990s, South Africa was on the brink of a civil war. And if you look at leaders such as Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, ultimately it becomes their willingness to negotiate, their willingness to talk, their willingness to then compromise and reach an agreement that can get South Africa on a path to democracy in 1994. Because both of those men, amongst other leaders within the country at the time, ultimately realized that if we don't negotiate and we don't compromise, South Africa will be stuck within a cycle of violence that will ultimately lead to a civil war within the country. So hopefully with that, learner, I've answered your question about the role of de Klerk. Let's have a look now at the CODESA talks. The CODESA talks are actually the talks that take place during this period of 1990. The talks we've divided into two. The one deals with CODESA 1. It says CODESA is the name given to the group of 19 political parties which negotiated a democratic South Africa. With that point, remember, grade 12s, that it's not only Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk who are important leaders within this process, who play a role in terms of bringing about democracy in the country. Each political party had representatives, leadership that helped negotiate a way for South Africa. The group would prepare, or their purpose would be to prepare the interim constitution. The labor movement, we know, played an important role during apartheid South Africa, when political liberation movements such as the ANC and the South African Communist Party and the PAC were banned. Trade unions played such an important role because trade unions represented workers. And trade unions had the workers' interests at heart. So we find that in the 1980s and early 1990s, trade unions were militant and they became politicized because of the need to represent the workers. So in the early 1990s, the tripartite alliance is formed between the ANC, the major trade union COSATU, and the South African Communist Party. It goes on. But CODESA talks would eventually break down. The ANC suspected that it was actually the government that had sent in the third forces and was stirring up violence around the country, and that they would start a campaign as a result of mass protests to put pressure on the government to stop it. By 1992, South Africa was in a difficult situation, grade 12s. There was the Boipatong massacre, where IFP supporters and police attacked and killed ANC supporters who were attending a funeral. You also had extreme right-wing Afrikaners who tried to use violence to halt our progress and stop negotiations. They attacked the building where the talks were going to be held. In paragraph 4 and paragraph 5, we need to mention the referendum. Remember, grade 12s, the referendum is where opinion or question is posed, and then your voters are going to vote simply yes or no. According to that referendum, they had to now decide whether negotiation should continue. So in the same year, de Klerk held a referendum for white voters. The majority voted in favor of reform and continued negotiations. So as a leader, de Klerk at the time decides that because the white voters are willing to go forward and progress with change, he will continue to lead the country through the process of change. In 1993, a very important leader within the ANC, Chris Hani, was assassinated. Lots of angry protests followed in the country, and we know that we had that cycle of violence that was continuing in the country. But it's as a result of that incident that the ANC and the government, the leaders, start to realize that it's so important and crucial to continue the talks. CODESA then starts, CODESA 2. They finally set up the interim constitution. They finalize the date that we will have our first democratic elections on. There are still some groups who wanted to prevent the election from being held, though. You had the APLA, the armed wing of the PAC, that attacked civilians. For example, we think about the St. James Church massacre in Cape Town, also in 1993. You also had the IFP leader, Buthelezi, who threatened to boycott the election. But then at the very last minute, he decides that his party will move forward with the process in South Africa and will be part of the 1994 elections. Here we start now to wrap up our essay. We start to give detail about the 1994 elections and the formation of the Government of National Unity. Also remember, grade 12s, we can include extra detail regarding ideas around Joe Slovo and the Sunset Clause, for example, in order to strengthen our line of argument as we go. Joe Slovo would be an example of a person who is not necessarily a leader of a political party, but he is an influential leader within the masses of the ANC. So there were attempts to disrupt the election, but they failed. The first democratic elections start on the 27th of April, 1994, and we know that those elections are held over 2 days. The ANC won the majority of support. The Government of National Unity was formed on the 10th of May, 1994. To prevent the possibility of a civil war in the country, though, the parties agreed to govern South Africa together for a limited period of time. Nelson Mandela, in the forming of the Government of National Unity, becomes the President of South Africa, and Thabo Mbeki and F.W. de Klerk are chosen as his deputy presidents. So, no essay is complete, grade 12s, unless you include a conclusion. you'll notice that if you have a look at your conclusion, again, I have hugged the question to give me guidance. And then when I feel confident, I break away from that original question quote that was given to me at the beginning, and I add in my own opinion to strengthen my conclusion. So my conclusion says, therefore, to a great extent, one can conclude that the political leadership and commitment by key South African role players paved the way for the birth of a non-racial democratic South Africa in 1994, which I'd proven in my essay. I then back up my point in conclusion by pointing out that it was the willingness of the leaders to negotiate and compromise that brought South Africa back from the brink of civil war. And in that way, I've included the focus area on violence as well. Essentially, then, grade 12s, what you do have is a strong line of argument as you've developed your essay. I've noticed that there is another message on the WhatsApp line. I'm just going to turn my attention to the screen and try and pull it out so that I can see what the learner has asked. Righto. Right, the learner has asked why Mandela decided to do negotiations with a National Party leader. Grade 12, the reason why Nelson Mandela actually agrees to enter this process of negotiations, the context for it lies much further back in history. If you start thinking back to the 1960s, I think it is, right? You've got 1960, the Sharpeville Massacre, and then from the Sharpeville Massacre, you've got the ANC military wing that gets formed, Umkhonto we Sizwe. That military wing was never formed with the intention of overthrowing the apartheid government. The intention of the ANC throughout history had always been to negotiate a process of change with the National Party and with the government. When government was not willing to negotiate change, we found that the ANC was pushed into a position where they had to form a military wing. So by 1990, when apartheid was in a state of a crippled state and the country was struggling to move forward, and government acknowledged that they were willing to negotiate, because even while Nelson Mandela was in prison, he said he would not allow himself to be released with any constraints, and ultimately, if he was released, it would have to be so that negotiations could take place. You find that although Nelson Mandela holds true to that value, it's not necessarily Nelson Mandela by himself that decides that negotiations are important. In 1990, when the leaders of the various parties come together and they are willing to have those negotiations, it's actually an ultimate aim of the ANC that had started earlier on. I don't even want to say the 1960s, because if you look at the earlier work of the ANC in the 1940s, 1913, if you think back to the Land Act that you did in grade 11, every time there is a willingness on the part of the ANC to negotiate and to talk and to compromise with the government. But up until that point, most of the attempts had failed. It's in 1990 that the various parties eventually get together and get to a point where they can say, right, we can talk. So I hope I've answered that question. You've asked, why did Mandela decide to negotiate with a National Party leader? And I've tried to explain to you that it's actually a contextual fact and value that goes further back into history. The ultimate aim of the ANC and the military Umkhonto we Sizwe was to always force government to a point of negotiations. It was never to topple the government in any way at the time. Then I see there are quite a few questions coming through now. We've got slightly less than 10 minutes. We're going to see how many of these questions we can get through. Right, let me find my way over here again. Right. The next person has asked, tell us about the importance of the Sunset Clause. Right. So the Sunset Clause basically comes from Joe Slovo. Lots of the problems and the issues in the country related to how South Africa was going to transition from apartheid into this democratic South Africa. We need to remember that South African citizens at the time felt unsettled. And grade 12s, when you feel unsettled, you tend to feel a sense of fear and anxiety. And so South Africans were looking for the best way to move forward and feel settled. According to the Sunset Clause, the basic idea would be that South Africa would transition with this government of national unity, a coalition government of sorts, where Nelson Mandela would be willing to work with various parties. And then in time, you'd have that process where the ANC was able to take control and lead the country fully. But the Sunset Clause was essentially a way for South Africa to further transition from the period of apartheid into a democratic, non-racial South Africa. Right, let me turn my little face this way and look for another one. Okay, we've done that one. I'm not quite sure what this question's asking. Let me just think about this. Okay. One of the learners has asked, what are the changes of NP and the government of South Africa? But I'm not quite certain what you meant exactly with that question. If you can possibly rephrase that question for me, give me some more clarity in terms of the detail that you want, then I can get back to you. And then I'm going to have a look at another one here. The learner says, what can I write on Google to Okay, righto. The learner says, what can I write on Google to download the exam guideline? I am going to ask the producer to take down your number, and I'm going to SMS you privately. But essentially what you should be able to do, grade 12s. Obviously, I teach in the Western Cape. I don't know where you attend, but the Western Cape has a very good educational website. So if you go to the WCED, if you type in WCED education website, and you go to the grade 12 section over there, you should be able to type in grade 12 exam guidelines. Grade 12 exam guidelines. Each grade 12 subject has exam guidelines for a particular subject. So if you do life science, for example, there will be a life science exam guideline. I do encourage you, though, grade 12s, to please work with the exam guidelines in conjunction with your teacher, because there might be information in the exam guidelines that you don't particularly need. So something that I do with my learners is we'll work with the exam guidelines, but I tell them where I want us to focus as a particular class. But I know for a fact you can go to the Education Department website, WC, the Western Cape Education Department website. You type in grade 12 exam guidelines, and you should be able to get a list for all of the subjects that you do. All right, let's check another question. Another learner has posed a very valid point over here. It's a question, but it's a very important point. I'm super impressed with you. The learner says, weren't the negotiations influenced by the collapse of communism in Soviet Union? You are spot on. It's definitely one of the factors. You need to remember that in the 1980s, the South African government was plugging the fact that there was the terror of communism that was being used by the African population in the country. They were saying that the African population were being supported by the communists and they were going to be attacked. Once communism collapsed, government could no longer use that fear as an excuse to influence white population and thought in the country. So when communism collapsed, you find that government is then further pushed into a position where they need to negotiate with the various parties. Lovely point that you've made there, grade 12 learner. Right, let's see what the next one says. Okay. The next learner has asked, when is the next sections? I know we've got another session coming up, not this month, I think later on, maybe around about September, October, and then we're going to focus on exam sessions. But you can just ask your teacher to scroll through your telematics booklet. It should have a section on when you have your various sessions as well, grade 12. Before time runs out, because I think there's another 2 questions I need to get through, let's look what this one says. The quick question I can answer in 2 seconds is, can you tell us about the whites-only referendum? So the whites-only referendum takes place, I think it's around about 1992. There's ongoing violence in the country. Negotiations seem to be struggling and floundering. And the National Party essentially puts forward a referendum, a yes-no vote. It's posed only to white voters. So there is a slight problem in the sense that they aren't consulting the masses in South Africa. And the question that is posed asks, must negotiations go forward? And by asking, must negotiations go forward, they are really asking, must we continue with the path and the road that we're on, transitioning to a democracy? And with the majority of white voters that voted yes in favor of negotiations continuing, you had the majority of the white population in the country saying it was time for change in South Africa. All right, let's see if we can do another quick question. I've got 1 minute, so I'm going to try and choose a question that I can answer in a minute. Right. I think this is a nice one that we can quickly try and answer. What managed to change Buthelezzi's mind to join the elections at the last minute? We know that he had threatened to not participate with his Inkatha Freedom Party. The fact of the matter, grade 12s, is that Buthelezi realized that democracy and non-racial elections were going to come to South Africa. Either himself and his party were going to get on board and participate, or they would be left behind and would not be part of the future South Africa. Grade 12s, I've enjoyed today's session. Thank you very much for your excellent questions. Thank you for your interaction. Remember, if you study, you will get excellent marks. Go well, grade 12s.